philosophical atheism has tracked with culture. So we kind of mentioned kind of Edinburgh and the UK and these sorts of places. Obviously, it began to kind of grow and change and has become an entire kind of well-established and well-respected field of philosophy, studied across the world and admired by many. So I would like to kind of just, before we kind of leave, I guess, the history section of this tour of kind of atheism, are there any other sort of key moments or figures that you'd want to speak about that kind of, I guess, touched a point with culture, kind of historically, and how their outworkings or thoughts around sort of philosophical atheism had that impact?
So there's a bunch of people here, some in France, some in the UK. And one person is Hume himself. And it, there's a lot of disagreement amongst philosophers about what Hume actually thought. My view, and I'm kind of tracking fairly closely with the views of Paul Russell, is that Hume was an atheist. And in the dialogues concerning natural religion, what he's actually doing is setting out a very strong argument against the existence of God. But it's dressed up in a dialogue form, and there's all kinds of red herrings, which mean that you have to work a bit in order to extract the argument. And I mean, you don't have to look very far. I already gave you the background that explains why Hume was very careful not to even publish the dialogues during his life. And his nephew and heir was instructed to publish it on his death. He wasn't prepared to have it come out before, and he was worried really about his social reputation, and with good reason. So he died in 1776. At that point, it was not socially acceptable in the UK. It hadn't been up until that point to profess atheism. There are kind of interesting cases. By reputation, some people thought of Hobbes as an atheist, but that was in the earlier sense that I was talking about. He just kind of had heretical ideas. But apparently there were some sort of wealthy young men who really were atheists. They weren't philosophers, they weren't kind of deep thinkers, but they'd kind of picked up in a sort of half-assed way from Hobbes a kind of materialistic atheistic aspect. So that's in the UK. I should add to that the first tract defending atheism that had the author's name on it came out about 5 years after Hume died. It was written by a Liverpool doctor, and it wasn't great philosophically, but it was sort of solid, right? And then there's a kind of period where other people are doing this. Atheism didn't really get kind of traction and public sympathy until at all, really. I mean, even Shelley got sent down from Oxford for writing an essay defending atheism. It really wasn't until the 1820s when Richard Carlile started publishing all of the tracts that had been written by atheists in the preceding 30 or 40 years and kept getting jailed for it, that public sympathy started to swing towards atheism because he was being given such a shit time by the authorities, right? So, and after that, you'll start to find some philosophers, though really not many until into the 20th century, who are prepared to give defences of atheism. So that's in the UK. In France, the really interesting figure is Jean Melier, who was a Catholic priest. So he's born, I think, in about 1660s, died in 1729. And in the last 10 years of his life, he wrote a kind of intellectual document. And his document was really interesting. It turns out that he was an atheist, and his most of the standard atheistic arguments that you find in, for example, the New Atheists are there in Melier. He was also an internationalist and a socialist and a kind of radical thinker in various kinds of ways. And he made 4 copies of his testament. That's the title that it eventually came to be called by. And somehow or other, the Testament eluded the church authorities and was captured by people who started circulating them in Paris in the 1730s. So this was a kind of clandestine circulation. And they were enormously influential. So there's a whole generation of people after Melier who basically just republished what he'd done. So Holbach, Voltaire, though Voltaire took out all of the political stuff he didn't like, he pretended that Melier was a deist because Voltaire himself was a deist. So he edited it very stringently so it looked like it was that Melier agreed with Voltaire on a whole lot of things, when in fact, compared to Melier, Voltaire was a bit of a, I don't know what's the right word, a bit of a pussy, so right. And Descartes, the philosophy in the boudoir, is basically all the philosophical stuff is cribbed from Melier as well. So he's a really interesting figure. The other interesting figure is Holbach, even though he wasn't a particularly kind of innovative as a philosopher. He certainly had played a major role in pushing atheism forward. So he was very wealthy. He inherited money from his uncle who made a fortune on the stock exchange, and he ran a salon in Paris, and everybody who was anybody was passed through his salon. He had a fantastic library. He had the best wine cellar in Paris. He had a great kitchen as well, and lots of interesting people would gather there, and their conversations were relatively free. Like you could say whatever you thought within the confines of the salon. And so there were some regular people, some of whom were atheists, and then just all these interesting people who went through there. And in the background, Holbach was a very prodigious writer, and he's writing lots of anonymous atheistic tracts that were circulating around Paris. Apparently none of the authorities knew that it was him, or if they did, they were prepared to put up with it because of, his public profile and so on. I mean, it's not really clear who knew. Hume went to the salon several times, and there's this story which I think is true, that Hume asked Holbach, do you think there's ever really been anyone who was an atheist? Now, why Hume would ask that question, I don't know. And Voltaire's reply is, sure, there's a bunch of them at the table. Right, so Melier is really a quite significant historical figure, I think.
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.